There is a place in Canada that the government does not want you to visit, not because it is dangerous in the way most dangerous things are, not because of an active disaster or a military operation or a natural hazard that can be explained in a single sentence. This place is restricted in a quieter, more deliberate way, the kind of restriction that comes with legal language carefully written to discourage questions, the kind of restriction that has been in place for so long that most Canadians have simply accepted it without ever thinking to ask why. It sits in the North Atlantic, out past the edge of the continental shelf, surrounded by some of the most unpredictable water on the planet. Ships have been dying against its shores for as long as ships have existed in this part of the world. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, if you count the ones nobody ever recorded. It appears on maps as a thin curved sliver, like a crescent moon laid on its side, like a scar in the ocean. It is 42 kilometers long, and in most places, barely a kilometer and a half wide. A strip of sand, essentially. A massive shifting dune that has no right to exist where it does, and yet there it is. 300 kilometers off the coast of Nova Scotia, sitting in the middle of the Atlantic approach to North America, as if it were placed there on purpose. Its name is Sable Island, and if you try to go there, the Canadian government will stop you. Not with force, not with guns or patrol boats, though those options have historically existed. They will stop you with paperwork, with permits, with a system so deliberately convoluted that most people simply give up. And the handful who do manage to secure access, researchers, scientists, photographers with the right institutional backing, they are watched, they are managed, they are given a very specific version of the island, a curated experience, a story that has been told so many times and refined so carefully that it has started to feel less like a true account and more like a rehearsed one. The official story is simple. Sable Island is a national park reserve. It is protected because of its unique ecology, because of the wild horses that have lived there for centuries, because of the fragile sand ecosystem and the nesting seabirds and the gray seal colonies and the scientific monitoring stations that have operated there since the 19th century. All of that is true. None of it is in question. What is in question is why the official story always stops exactly where it does. Why certain chapters of Sable Island's history are discussed in academic papers with a clinical detachment that feels almost designed to discourage further reading. Why the records from certain periods are incomplete in ways that seem less like the natural decay of old documents and more like the deliberate removal of specific pages. Why a small number of people who have spent time on that island have come back with stories that do not match the brochure. And why, when you start pulling at any of those threads, the response from the institutions that control access to Sable Island is always the same. A polite silence, followed by a redirect, followed by nothing at all. This is the story of Sable Island, not the version that appears in tourism pamphlets, not the romantic narrative of wild horses on windswept dunes. The full story, the one that starts in the 16th century with a man who may have committed one of the strangest crimes in the history of European colonization, and ends in the present day with a government that has quietly built one of the most effective information barriers around a piece of land that, on paper, is just a sandbar. Before we continue, if you find yourself at the edge of something you can't quite explain, subscribe. Leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. And click the like button because the algorithm treats curiosity the same way governments treat forbidden islands. It only shows it to people who prove they want to find it. To understand why Sable Island is what it is, you have to understand what it looks like from above. From a satellite, it looks almost unreal. The water around it is a deep Atlantic blue-gray, the kind of color that belongs to cold, deep, unforgiving ocean. And then there is this thin crescent of pale sand, almost luminous from altitude, curving through that dark water like something that was dropped there by accident. It does not look like it belongs to the geography around it. It looks like a mistake, like someone drew a line in the wrong place. The island sits on the edge of the Scotian shelf, at the point where the relatively shallow continental waters drop away into the deep Atlantic basin. This geographic position is crucial to understanding almost everything that has happened there. The waters around Sable Island are where the cold Labrador Current and the warm Gulf Stream collide. That collision produces fog, dense, total, disorienting fog that can appear in minutes and reduce visibility to near zero. It produces storms that arrive fast and hit hard. It produces currents that change direction unpredictably. It produces exactly the kind of conditions that have made this one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the planet for sailing ships. And for centuries, no one could do anything about it because you cannot navigate fog. You cannot see through, and you cannot avoid a sandbar. You did not know was there until your hull was already on it. The recorded shipwreck count for Sable Island stands at somewhere around 350. That is the number of wrecks that were documented by the life-saving stations that operated on the island from the early 19th century onward. But those stations only existed for roughly 160 years. Before they were built, ships were dying against Sable Island's shores for 300 years with no one to write down what happened. The actual number of vessels lost in those waters is almost certainly in the thousands. The island earned its nickname, the Graveyard of the Atlantic, not from a single catastrophic event, but from a continuous, relentless accumulation of disasters across 5 centuries. All of that cargo is still down there, the gold and silver that was moving between the old world and the new, the trade goods, the weapons, the supplies, the personal effects of the thousands of people who drowned in those waters or who managed to make it to the island shore, only to face a different kind of survival problem on a strip of sand with no fresh water source, no shelter, and no way to signal the mainland. The island kept everything it was given. It is still keeping it. The sand itself is part of why the island is so strange. Sable Island is not made of bedrock. It has no solid geological foundation. It is a massive accumulation of sand, essentially a dune system, held together by grass and anchored to the Scotian shelf by nothing more reliable than the particular way the currents move around it. The island shifts. This is not a metaphor. The physical geography of Sable Island changes measurably from year to year. The eastern tip of the island has been moving, on average, about 220 meters per year in the direction the dominant currents push it. The western end erodes. The middle stays relatively stable. The whole island is in slow, constant motion, and as it moves, it reveals things. Old wreck material, debris from the life-saving stations, objects that have been buried in the sand for so long that no one is alive who remembers them being put there. What the island has revealed over the centuries has not always been documented publicly. This is something that researchers who have worked on Sable Island will acknowledge if you ask them the right way. The island gives things up on its own schedule, and not everything that comes out of the sand ends up in a published report. The first European to use Sable Island deliberately, not as an accidental destination, but as a chosen one, was a French nobleman named Troilus de la Roche de Mesgues. The year was 1598. De Mesgues had a patent from the French crown to colonize the Atlantic coast of North America, and he had a problem. He had been given authority to build a colony, but he did not have enough willing colonists. He had, however, access to a group of people who did not need to be willing. He had access to prisoners. The people de Mesgues deposited on Sable Island in 1598 were convicts. Approximately 50 to 60 of them, taken from French prisons and brought across the Atlantic to serve as the involuntary founding population of a colony on a sandbar in the middle of the ocean. They were given minimal supplies. They were told that ships would come back for them. And then the ships left. The ships did not come back on any reliable schedule. French imperial priorities shifted. De Mesgoas lost his patent. The convicts on Sable Island were left alone for 5 years, during which they did what people left alone in impossible situations sometimes do. They survived. They found the freshwater ponds that collect in the island's interior. They hunted the walruses that were then abundant on the island's beaches. They salvaged what they could from the wrecks that continued to appear on the shores around them. They built rough shelters from the same wrecked timber, and they killed each other. By the time a relief ship finally arrived in 1603, only 11 of the original colonists were still alive. Those 11 men had been living on that island for 5 years with no contact with the outside world, no news, no rescue, no explanation for why they had been forgotten. When they were brought back to France, they were brought before the king. They were, by all accounts, wild-looking men by that point, bearded and weathered and dressed in animal skins. The king, Henry IV, was apparently moved by their condition and ordered them pardoned and given money. And that, as far as the official record is concerned, is where the story of the first Sable Island colony ends. But there is a detail in that story that gets less attention than it deserves. Those 11 men who survived, what did they tell the king beyond the basic facts of their survival? The accounts that exist from that audience describe the king being moved by their hardship. They describe the pardons and the gifts. They do not describe in any meaningful detail what the survivors said about the island itself, what they had found there, what they had learned about its geography, about what the shifting sands had given up in 5 years of living on them. For a place that was being actively considered as a potential site for further French colonization, the absence of detailed debriefing records is unusual. It is possible those records were lost. Records from early modern Europe are lost all the time, but it is also possible that what those 11 men reported about Sable Island was considered, by someone in the French court, to be the kind of information that did not need to be widely circulated. It is a small thing to notice, and on its own it means nothing, but it is the first time, not the last, that the record around Sable Island goes quiet in a way that is hard to explain by accident alone. For the next century and a half, Sable Island existed primarily as a hazard on navigation charts and a source of occasional salvage. Ships continued to wreck there. The Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia, who had known about the island for far longer than any European, continued to regard it with a specific kind of attention that their oral traditions record, but that academic scholarship has largely treated as peripheral. The Mi'kmaq name for Sable Island translates roughly to something like Island of the Winds, or in some versions, the place that moves. Both names reflect an understanding of the island's physical reality that European cartographers would not confirm for another 2 centuries. The Mi'kmaq knew the island shifted. They knew it from observation, from generation upon generation of tracking where it was and noting how the information did not quite match the last time anyone had checked. The Mi'kmaq relationship with Sable Island is one of the most underexplored dimensions of its history. The island is well beyond paddling distance from the mainland under normal conditions, but the Mi'kmaq were seafaring people of considerable skill, and the idea that they had no direct knowledge of or engagement with a major geographic feature 300 kilometers offshore is one that some scholars find implausible. What is certain is that Mi'kmaq oral tradition contains extensive references to the island and attributes to it a significance that goes beyond simple navigation. The island appears in stories as a place of power, a place of transformation, a place where the boundary between the physical world and something else was thinner than usual. These are the kinds of descriptions that are easy to dismiss as mythology, and they are routinely dismissed as exactly that in academic writing about Sable Island. But they are also the kinds of descriptions that often encode real information about a place in the only format available to people who do not use written records. What the Mi'kmaq knew about Sable Island that European settlers did not, and when that knowledge was or was not sought by the colonial administration, is a question that has not been seriously investigated. The colonial archive's relationship with Indigenous knowledge about specific geographical locations is a complex one, and Sable Island is not unique in having that dimension of its history underexplored. But given what we know about how the island was subsequently used, the question of what was already known about it before Europeans decided they owned it is not an academic one. It is the kind of question whose answer might explain a great deal. The chapter of Sable Island's history that is discussed most carefully in language that is most deliberately neutral involves the Acadians. The Acadian deportation of 1755 is one of the most significant events in Canadian history. A forced removal of a French-speaking population from the maritime provinces that scattered thousands of people across the Atlantic world and destroyed a culture that had been building for a century and a half. The deportation was brutal and chaotic and involved atrocities that were not fully acknowledged by the Canadian government until 2003. What is less commonly discussed in general accounts of the deportation is the specific fate of a group of Acadians who were transported to Sable Island. The details of this particular episode are difficult to reconstruct because the records are incomplete in ways that historians have noted without fully resolving. What appears to have happened, based on available evidence, is that a number of Acadian deportees, the exact number is disputed, with estimates ranging from a few dozen to several hundred, were placed on Sable Island, either by accident, because ships in the chaotic deportation fleet were wrecked there, or by design as a deliberate way of disposing of a population that the colonial administration did not know what else to do with. The distinction between accident and design matters enormously in the moral accounting of the deportation. If Acadians ended up on Sable Island because ships wrecked there, that is a tragedy. If they were deliberately deposited there, it is something closer to a death sentence, because Sable Island in 1755 had no infrastructure, no food supply, no fresh water beyond the interior ponds, and no way off. To leave people there without a committed plan for their rescue would have been to leave them to die. The records do not clearly resolve which version is true, and this is where the specific incompleteness of the Sable Island archive begins to feel less like the natural erosion of old documents and more like a pattern. The colonial administration of Nova Scotia kept records, not complete records, not by modern standards, but records. Ships were logged, passengers were listed, at least in broad terms. When specific episodes are difficult to trace, it is usually because those episodes were not recorded at the time, which raises the question of why a colonial administration that was otherwise committed to documenting its operations would fail to record what happened to a group of people it had taken legal custody of. Some Acadian descendants have maintained oral traditions about Sable Island that are at odds with the official historical account. These traditions are difficult to verify and have been largely excluded from mainstream historical scholarship, partly because of the methodological challenges of working with oral sources, and partly, one suspects, because of where they lead if taken seriously. They describe Sable Island not as an accidental destination, but as a deliberate one. They describe people who were left there with the expectation that they would not survive, and who, against that expectation, some of them did. And they describe those survivors as eventually making their way off the island and back to mainland communities, carrying with them information about the island that was sufficiently troubling to someone in the colonial administration that efforts were made to discourage them from speaking about it openly. This is a serious claim, and it should be treated carefully. Oral traditions that accuse governments of deliberate acts of concealment need to be weighed against the possibility of narrative drift, of stories that have become more dramatic over generations of telling. That is a real risk in working with oral history, and responsible scholarship acknowledges it. But responsible scholarship also acknowledges that oral traditions sometimes preserve accurate information about events that the written record has been made to forget. The history of colonial Canada is full of examples of exactly that, and the specific content of the Acadian Sable Island oral tradition, the claim that survivors reported finding something on the island that alarmed the colonial administration, is the kind of claim that should at least be investigated before being dismissed. What they found, according to those traditions, was evidence that Sable Island had been used before, not by Europeans, and not in a way that could be easily explained by the history that the colonial administration understood. The establishment of permanent British presence on Sable Island came in 1801, when the government of Nova Scotia, under pressure from the ongoing shipping disaster that the island represented, finally committed to building a life-saving station there. The man most responsible for making this happen was a Boston-born merchant and humanitarian named Andrew Heck, more commonly known by his anglicized name in Canadian records as simply the man who put Sable Island on the map in a practical sense, as opposed to a navigational one. He lobbied the government for years, documenting the wreck toll, calculating the cost in lives and cargo, and making the straightforward economic and moral argument that a small investment in a permanent presence on the island would save both money and lives. The argument eventually worked. The first Sable Island establishment, as it was officially called, was built on the island in 1801, and it functioned continuously for nearly 2 centuries, transitioning through various governmental departments as Canada's colonial and then federal administration evolved. The life-saving station became a weather station, became a research station, became a Parks Canada operation. Each transition was documented. Each generation of people who lived and worked on the island left records. And across 2 centuries of continuous human habitation, those records paint a picture of the island that is, in the main, consistent with the official account, but not entirely consistent. There are gaps, not dramatic gaps, not the kind that would flag immediately as suspicious in a casual reading, the kind of gaps that only become visible when you read the records in sequence and notice that certain subjects appear repeatedly and then at a specific point in time stop appearing, or that certain individuals who are mentioned prominently in the records from one period are not mentioned at all in the records from a following period without any explanation for their absence, or that the inventories of objects recovered from the beach, the ongoing process of cataloging what the island's shifting sand gave up each season, contain entries that are described in vague terms in some years and simply not mentioned at all in others. The people who worked on Sable Island across those 2 centuries were, for the most part, isolated. The island's remoteness meant that the workforce was small, rotation was infrequent by modern standards, and the community of people who had direct experience of the place was always tiny. Those who left the island after their posting was complete, returned to mainland communities where their specific knowledge of what they had seen and experienced had limited audience. Some of them wrote, some of them talked. A small number of first-person accounts of life on Sable Island exist in archives and published collections, and these accounts are almost uniformly preoccupied with the same things: the horses, the weather, the fog, the isolation, the extraordinary and slightly unsettling quality of living on a piece of land that is not quite stable, that shifts around you on a geological timescale that is fast enough to notice in a human lifetime. Within those accounts, buried in the kind of offhand remarks that writers make when they are describing something they consider too ordinary to require elaboration, there are references that do not fit the official picture. A mention in a letter from a life-saving station keeper in the 1840s of a structure found in the eastern part of the island that predated any European presence the keeper was aware of, described in a single sentence and then never mentioned again. A reference in a government inspection report from the early 20th century to an area of the island that was designated as off-limits to station personnel without any explanation for why. A notation in a scientific survey from the 1970s of what the surveyor describes as an anomalous subsurface feature in the central portion of the island, detected by ground-penetrating survey equipment that the report recommends for further investigation, and that, as far as subsequent published research indicates, was never investigated further. These are fragments. They do not add up to a coherent counter-narrative on their own, but they share a quality that is difficult to ignore once you notice it. Each of them is the kind of observation that, if followed up, would lead somewhere interesting. And in each case, there is no record of anyone following up. The horses are, in many ways, the perfect distraction, not a deliberate distraction. The horses are real. They are genuinely remarkable, and they deserve the attention they receive. But they function in the public presentation of Sable Island as the thing you look at when you might otherwise be asking harder questions. The wild horses of Sable Island are descended from domestic animals brought to the island in the 18th century. The most widely accepted account of their origin places them as Acadian horses, animals left behind or deliberately released during the disruptions of the deportation period. This origin story has a neat symbolic quality. The horses as living symbols of a dispossessed people carrying on in exile on an impossible sandbar, adapting to a life that should by rights be unsurvivable and somehow thriving in it. It is a beautiful story. It is also a story that connects the horses, and by extension the island's most visible and emotionally compelling feature, to the Acadian deportation, which is itself a chapter of Canadian history that the government has found it easier to acknowledge in general terms than to investigate in specific ones. The horses have been studied extensively. They are one of the best documented wild horse populations in the world, in part because Sable Island is so remote that the horses have almost no outside influence, no predators, no human interaction beyond the limited presence of station personnel, no food supplementation, no veterinary intervention. They live and die by island conditions. This has made them an extraordinary natural laboratory for studying population dynamics, adaptation, and evolutionary biology. Researchers from universities across Canada and around the world have produced hundreds of papers on the Sable Island horses. What those papers do not address, because it is not their subject, is the question of what the horses are living on top of. Sable Island sand is not inert. It is layered. Different depths represent different time periods, and the material preserved in those layers, organic matter, artifacts, structural debris, represents a continuous record of everything that has happened on and around the island across centuries. The horses walk over that record every day. They graze on the grass that grows from it, and because the island is always moving, that record is always being reshuffled, with old material coming to the surface in unexpected places and new material being buried before anyone has had a chance to examine it properly. The scientific monitoring on Sable Island that has produced so much knowledge about the horses has, by comparison, produced relatively little systematic and archaeological knowledge about what is in the sand beneath them. This is not an accident of prioritization. The federal government's management framework for Sable Island explicitly limits the kinds of research that can be conducted there. The National Park Reserve designation, which was formalized in 2013, created a legal framework that protects the island's ecology, while also, as a practical matter, restricting the types of subsurface investigation that would be required to properly characterize its archaeological content. The question that serious researchers of Sable Island's history find themselves returning to, and which the management framework does not address directly, is whether the restriction on subsurface investigation is a consequence of the ecological protection mandate or a reason for it. The practical effect is the same either way. The ground beneath Sable Island has not been systematically excavated, and there is no funded, permitted program to do so. The island's sand is giving things up anyway, on its own schedule, and the things it gives up are handled by Parks Canada and by the small community of permitted researchers who are allowed on the island. The disposition of unusual finds is, by the management framework, at the discretion of Parks Canada in consultation with relevant federal departments, which relevant federal departments are consulted, in which cases is not public information. The weather station on Sable Island is one of the longest-running continuous meteorological observation points in North America. Weather data has been collected there since 1871, and the dataset produced by that continuous observation is genuinely invaluable for understanding the climate history of the North Atlantic. Climate scientists regard the Sable Island weather record as a primary source, the kind of long, unbroken observational series that is increasingly rare and therefore increasingly precious as climate science attempts to reconstruct historical baseline conditions. This is the officially stated primary scientific reason for maintaining a permanent human presence on Sable Island today. The weather station and the atmospheric research that has grown around it provides the justification for the infrastructure, the buildings, the runway, the fuel storage, the communication equipment that sustains human habitation on an island that would otherwise be extremely difficult and expensive to support. The atmospheric research conducted on Sable Island goes beyond basic meteorology. The island's position in the open Atlantic, away from the interference of continental land masses, at a latitude where interesting atmospheric chemistry happens, makes it an ideal location for monitoring a range of atmospheric phenomena. Research institutions from multiple countries have conducted work on Sable Island, studying everything from long-range transport of air pollutants to the behavior of aerosols to the electromagnetic properties of the lower atmosphere in the marine boundary layer. Some of that research is published in peer-reviewed journals and is straightforwardly accessible. Some of it is conducted under governmental or intergovernmental mandates that do not require public disclosure of findings. The distinction between these two categories of research is not always clear from the outside. The list of organizations that have conducted research on Sable Island includes universities, environmental agencies, and departments of the Canadian federal government whose primary mandates are not scientific in the conventional sense. Defense Research and Development Canada, which is the research arm of the Canadian Department of National Defense, has had an operational interest in Sable Island at various points in its history. The nature of that interest, beyond general statements about maritime surveillance and environmental monitoring, is not a matter of public record. The island's location makes it militarily significant in ways that have been true since the beginning of the Cold War and remain true today. Sable Island sits at the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the approach to the entire eastern seaboard of North America. A monitoring installation at that location has obvious value for tracking submarine activity, surface vessels, and aircraft. During World War II, the waters around Sable Island were among the most active in the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats operated extensively in those waters, and the island's position made it a natural observation point for Allied forces trying to track submarine movements. The extent to which Sable Island was used for military intelligence purposes during the war has not been fully declassified. After the war, as the Cold War developed a strategic logic that made the North Atlantic a central theater of geopolitical competition, Sable Island's value as a monitoring location did not diminish. The SOSUS network, the Sound Surveillance System, a classified network of underwater hydrophones that the United States and its allies used to track Soviet submarines, was one of the most secret and strategically significant intelligence programs of the Cold War. SOSUS installations were placed at geographically strategic points around the Atlantic. Whether Sable Island was one of those points is not confirmed in any declassified document available to the public. What is documented is that the island has been the site of various classified communications and intelligence activities across the decades, and that the federal government has, at various times, cited national security considerations as a reason for restricting access. These citations are not always visible in the public-facing explanations of why the island is closed. They appear in the fine print of access regulations and in occasional parliamentary discussions of the island's status, where they are mentioned briefly and then moved past. The layering of justifications for restricting access to Sable Island, ecological, scientific, meteorological, and security-based, means that at any given moment the government has multiple available reasons to deny access without needing to invoke any single one in a way that invites scrutiny. If you ask about the ecology, you get the ecology answer. If you ask about the weather station, you get the weather station answer. If you push further, you eventually encounter language about national security that is deliberately imprecise and not open to follow-up questions. This is, it should be said, not unique to Sable Island. Governments maintain restricted zones for layered and overlapping reasons all the time, and the use of multiple justifications for a single restriction is standard administrative practice, not necessarily evidence of concealment. The question is whether the specific combination of restrictions around Sable Island and the specific history of the island makes the standard explanation sufficient. There are people who have lived on Sable Island, not visited it, lived there for extended periods, as part of the station workforce that has maintained human habitation continuously for over 2 centuries. Some of those people are still alive. Most of them, understandably, do not attract media attention. The island is remote enough, and the community of people with direct experience of it small enough, that those who spent time there largely move back into ordinary life without being asked many questions. The ones who have spoken publicly about their experience of living on the island consistently describe it in terms that go beyond the practical and ecological. The island does something to people. This is not a supernatural claim. It is a psychological one. Isolation does something to people, and the specific quality of Sable Island's isolation is different from other forms of remoteness. The island is not merely far from other people. It is far from stable ground. The sand moves under your feet in a literal sense. The fog creates a condition of sensory enclosure that has no equivalent in mainland experience. The horses are present in a way that is hard to describe, not wild in the chaotic sense, but not tame, existing in a state of relationship with human presence that is unique and slightly uncanny. And the ocean is always there, always audible, always capable of changing the island's shape while you sleep. People who have lived on Sable Island for extended periods report a kind of perceptual recalibration that happens gradually, a heightening of attention to environmental detail, a changed relationship with time, partly because the island's remoteness makes mainland time rhythms irrelevant, and partly because the island's physical impermanence makes you aware of time in a different register, not the human scale of hours and days, but the geological scale at which the island is actually operating. You become aware, living there, that the ground you are standing on is temporary, in a way that mainland ground is not, that what is under the sand now will not necessarily be under the sand in 50 years, that the island is sorting itself constantly. Some of the people who have lived there for long enough to experience this perceptual shift describe finding things. Objects that come up through the sand without any obvious context, pieces of timber that are not from any wreck in the documented record, stone formations that do not correspond to any natural geological process that should be producing stone formations on a sand island. Small objects, metal, worked material, that are old enough to precede European contact with the island, but do not correspond to any known indigenous material culture from the region. These accounts are anecdotal. They are the kinds of accounts that serious historians handle with great caution, and rightly so. But they exist in sufficient number from people who have no obvious reason to fabricate or exaggerate that they form a pattern worth noting, and the consistent element in them is not what was found, that varies from account to account, but what happened when those finds were reported. In almost every case, the response from station management or from the governmental agency managing the island was the same. The material was collected, its finder was told that it would be assessed and reported through the appropriate channels, and no further information was provided to the person who made the find. The appropriate channels. This phrase appears often enough in the accounts of people who have worked on Sable Island that it has taken on a quality of its own. There are appropriate channels, and those channels lead somewhere, and what happens in them is not visible to the people who put things into them. The institutional structure around Sable Island is designed, whether intentionally or as an emergent property of bureaucratic accretion, to absorb unusual information without generating visible output. The oil and gas dimension of Sable Island's story is the one that is perhaps most straightforwardly explicable in conventional terms, and it is also the one that raises the most uncomfortable questions about what the Canadian government's long-term interests in the island's restricted status actually are. The Sable Offshore Energy Project, which began production in 1999 and operated for nearly 2 decades before decommissioning began in 2018, extracted natural gas from fields beneath the Scotian Shelf in the waters around Sable Island. At its peak, the project was producing over 500 million cubic feet of natural gas per day, making it one of the most significant energy projects in Atlantic Canadian history. The project involved multiple major energy companies, billions of dollars of infrastructure, and a complex regulatory framework that required careful management of the relationship between industrial extraction activities and the protected status of the island itself. The protected status of Sable Island during the period when the offshore energy project was active served multiple functions simultaneously. It protected the island's ecology from direct industrial impact, which was the stated purpose of the protection. It also, as a practical matter, limited independent access to the island and its immediate surroundings during the period when those surroundings were being intensively developed for resource extraction. The scientific and monitoring access to the island that was permitted during this period was largely conducted by parties with interests aligned with the energy project. Environmental monitoring organizations contracted by the project operators, governmental agencies with regulatory responsibilities for offshore energy. Research institutions funded in part by the energy companies themselves. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of how resource extraction projects are managed in regulatory environments. The monitoring infrastructure tends to be owned or influenced by the entities being monitored because they are the ones funding it. The result is a form of information management that does not require deliberate concealment to function. Information that is useful to the project's operators gets published. Information that is not useful gets set aside, not necessarily suppressed, but simply not prioritized for publication. In a system where publication requires resources and resources follow interests. What this means for understanding Sable Island is that the most intensive period of investigation of the waters and sediments around the island, the period during which the Scotian Shelf was being mapped, drilled, and analyzed in unprecedented detail in preparation for and during the energy extraction project, produced a body of knowledge about the island's geological and archaeological subsurface environment that has not been made fully public. The seismic surveys that were conducted to identify and characterize the gas fields around Sable Island also necessarily characterize the geological structure of the island itself and the seafloor around it. That data, in its complete form, belongs to the energy companies that commissioned the surveys and to the government agencies that oversaw the project. What those surveys found, beyond the gas fields that justified the project, has not been systematically disclosed. The subsurface geological structure of Sable Island and of the ancient seabed around it that was dry land during the last ice age, when sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today, is not a matter of public knowledge. During the last ice age, when sea levels in this part of the Atlantic were approximately 100 meters lower than they are now, the Scotian Shelf was a vast coastal plain. The area now occupied by the ocean around Sable Island was dry land, traversable on foot, potentially habitable, potentially inhabited. The archaeological implications of this fact, that the seafloor around Sable Island is a submerged landscape from a period of human prehistory, are understood by researchers. The investigation of that submerged landscape has not been a priority. The geophysical data that would enable such investigation exists. It is proprietary. The entities that own it have not chosen to share it with archaeologists or historians, and the governmental framework that manages access to Sable Island and its surroundings has not required them to. There is a layer to Sable Island's history that is almost never discussed in mainstream accounts, and which requires stepping back from the specific history of this particular island to understand a much larger geographic and archaeological context. The Scotian Shelf, the submerged continental margin on which Sable Island sits, was dry land during the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago. At that time, sea levels globally were roughly 100 to 120 meters lower than they are today. What is now the floor of the Atlantic Ocean off Nova Scotia was a coastal plain, exposed, terrestrial, and connected to what is now the Atlantic coast of North America by continuous dry land. The implications of this for understanding the deep history of the Americas are significant and have been seriously discussed in academic archaeology for several decades. The peopling of the Americas, the process by which human beings first arrived in the Western Hemisphere, is one of the most contested questions in all of prehistory. The traditional model, which dominated academic thinking for most of the 20th century, proposed that the first Americans entered through a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska and moved south through the interior of the continent. Evidence accumulated over the past 30 years has significantly complicated that model, suggesting that coastal migration routes, using small boats to move along the Pacific and potentially the Atlantic coastlines, may have been equally or more important. If coastal migration along the Atlantic margin is part of how the Americas were peopled, then the submerged Scotian shelf, which, during the glacial maximum, formed a significant section of that Atlantic coastline, may contain archaeological evidence of some of the earliest human presence in North America. The sites where those early migrants lived and camped and built fires and buried their dead would now be underwater on the seafloor of the Atlantic at depths that make them genuinely difficult to access and investigate. But they would be there. Sable Island sits on a high point of the Scotian Shelf, one of the places where the ancient landscape came closest to the surface. During the glacial maximum, what is now Sable Island was likely a prominent geographic feature on that ancient coastal plain, a rise in the landscape, possibly a headland or a promontory or a high dune complex, the kind of landmark that early coastal inhabitants would have used for navigation, for shelter, for the kinds of activities that tend to leave lasting archaeological traces. The possibility that Sable Island was a significant landmark in the deep prehistoric landscape of the Atlantic coast, and that the sand beneath it and the seafloor around it contains evidence of very early human occupation, is not a fringe idea. It is a scientifically reasonable hypothesis that follows logically from established geological knowledge. The investigation of that hypothesis would require exactly the kinds of subsurface investigation on Sable Island and in its surrounding waters that the current management framework does not permit and does not fund. Whether this is connected to the government's reasons for restricting access to the island, or whether it is simply a consequence of the island's remote location and the general underfunding of North American maritime archaeology, is not something that can be determined from publicly available information. What can be said is that if Sable Island does contain evidence of very early human occupation, evidence that would significantly complicate or rewrite the accepted understanding of when and how the Americas were peopled, the current access and research framework would effectively prevent that evidence from being found, documented, and published. This may be the most important thing about Sable Island's restricted status, not the military activity, not the oil and gas interests, not the Cold War intelligence infrastructure, but the possibility that the ground beneath the island holds answers to questions about human history that would require a fundamental revision of the story. The Canadian government, and more broadly, Western academia, has told about who was here first and when. The wild horses of Sable Island became the subject of formal protection in 1960, when an act of parliament prohibited their removal from the island. Before that, the horses had been periodically rounded up and taken off the island to be sold. The 1953 roundup, which removed approximately half the island's horse population for sale primarily as pet food, caused a public outcry significant enough to trigger the eventual legislative protection. The story of that roundup and the public reaction to it is a well-documented episode in the history of the animal rights movement in Canada and in the political history of Atlantic Canadian cultural identity. What is less well documented is the nature of the government's engagement with Sable Island in the decade before the 1960 protection was enacted. The late 1950s were a period of significant federal government interest in Sable Island that went beyond the horse question. This was the height of the Cold War, the period when the NORAD agreement between Canada and the United States was creating a new integrated continental defense infrastructure, and when the strategic significance of Canada's Atlantic approaches was being reassessed in the context of Soviet nuclear capability. The federal government's various departments were engaged in a comprehensive review of Canadian territory for its potential security and strategic value. Sable Island appears in the records of this period in ways that have not been fully examined. The island's meteorological station was upgraded in the 1950s. Communication infrastructure was improved. The access protocols around the island were modified in ways that made the existing restrictions more systematic and more legible as a formal exclusion policy rather than a practical inconvenience. The island was, during this period, being institutionalized as a restricted zone in a way it had not quite been before. The restrictions formalized, the justifications codified, the exceptions carefully defined. The people most directly affected by this formalization were the island station workers and their families, who experienced a tightening of the information environment around the island during this period. What could be communicated off the island, through what channels, and to whom became more regulated. This was framed in the internal governmental communications that have been partially declassified under Canada's Access to Information Framework as a matter of communication security. In a Cold War context, the information about atmospheric conditions and weather patterns collected on Sable Island had strategic value, and its transmission needed to be controlled. But the scope of what was classified as sensitive during this period extended beyond meteorological data in ways that some who worked on the island during those years found puzzling. Personal correspondence was subject to review in a manner that station workers of earlier periods had not experienced. The informal communication networks between the island and the mainland communities where station workers' families lived were monitored in ways that felt, to some, disproportionate to the stated security rationale, and the specific instructions given to station personnel about what they should and should not discuss when off the island were, according to accounts from that period, broader than the weather-related intelligence concerns that were offered as justification. This is consistent with a general pattern of Cold War era information management that applied to many restricted locations across Canada and did not necessarily indicate anything unusual about Sable Island specifically. The federal government during that period was not subtle about its intention to control information from strategically sensitive locations, and anyone working at such a location would have been subject to similar management. The question is whether the specific content of what station workers were asked not to discuss, beyond atmospheric data and communication infrastructure, reflects something particular to Sable Island or something general to Cold War-era security culture. The answer, based on available evidence, is ambiguous, which is, at this point in the investigation of Sable Island's history, the expected answer. There is a letter in the Provincial Archives of Nova Scotia written in 1887 by the superintendent of the Sable Island establishment that has attracted some academic attention and considerably more attention in the informal community of people interested in the island's stranger dimensions. The letter is addressed to the Minister of Marine and Fisheries in Ottawa and concerns the discovery by station personnel of what the superintendent describes as a formation of stones in the interior of the island's eastern section that he cannot account for by any natural process he is familiar with. The superintendent was not an archaeologist or a geologist. He was a practical man responsible for the operation of a life-saving and meteorological station on an extremely remote island, and his report of the stone formation is written in the matter-of-fact language of an administrator describing a maintenance issue. He notes the stones. He describes their arrangement, though the description is not detailed enough to be technically useful. He mentions that the formation appears to be old. He uses the phrase considerably older than any works I know to have been made on this island, and he asks for guidance on whether he should investigate further or leave the formation as he found it. The response from Ottawa, which is also in the archives, is brief. It thanks the superintendent for his report and instructs him to take no action pending further direction from the department. The further direction appears never to have arrived. There is no subsequent correspondence in the file about the stone formation. The superintendent's annual reports for the following years make no mention of it. Whatever the stones were, wherever they are now on an island whose surface changes continuously, the official response to their discovery was to ask the person who found them to do nothing, and then to provide no follow-up. This is a single episode. It is not conclusive in its evidence of anything, but it is representative of a pattern that repeats across the documented history of Sable Island. Find something unusual, report it. Be told to wait for direction, receive no direction, let the matter drop. The sand moves, the island shifts. Whatever was found gets covered again or eroded away. The record of its discovery remains in an archive where it will not be found unless someone knows to look for it. The question of what the stone formation was, whether it was a natural geological feature that the superintendent misinterpreted, or a remnant of indigenous use of the island, or something associated with the early European colonial period, or something that predates all of those categories, cannot now be answered. The island's surface is not what it was in 1887. The specific location described in the superintendent's letter may not even be geographically meaningful anymore in terms of where things currently are. The island has moved since then. Things have been buried. Other things have come up. What remains is the letter and the pattern it exemplifies, and the question it implies. How many other such letters are in the archives? From 2 centuries of station superintendents and scientific personnel and casual workers describing things found on the island that were reported upward and absorbed into administrative silence. The most recent comprehensive attempt to understand what Sable Island actually is, geologically, archaeologically, environmentally, historically, was the research synthesis produced in the context of the 2013 National Park Reserve designation. The designation required the federal government to produce a management plan, and the management plan required a baseline assessment of what was known about the island's natural and cultural heritage. That assessment was produced by government scientists and heritage specialists and is available as a public document. The document is thorough on the ecological dimensions of the island's heritage and relatively thin on the historical and archaeological dimensions. The section dealing with the island's human history follows the standard outline. First Nations use of the island noted briefly. Without specific detail, European contact period covered from Demiskoas onward, the establishment period treated comprehensively. The document acknowledges, in general terms, the archaeological potential of the island and of the submerged lands around it, and it recommends that archaeological assessment be considered as part of the ongoing management of the park reserve. It does not recommend a timeline for that assessment. It does not identify funding for it. It does not establish priorities or protocols for what happens when archaeological material is found during routine management activities. These are the kinds of operational details that would normally accompany a heritage management recommendation, and their absence from the document is notable. The recommendation to consider archaeological assessment is present. The infrastructure to act on that recommendation is not. Parks Canada, which manages the island, does have an archaeology program. That program has conducted work on Sable Island, primarily focused on the historical period, the wreck material, the station buildings, the artifacts associated with the establishment's long operation. This work is legitimate and valuable and has produced useful knowledge about the island's recorded history. What it has not done is address the island's pre-contact heritage in any systematic way. Access to information requests filed by researchers attempting to understand the scope of archaeological work conducted on Sable Island have produced partial responses. Some material has been released, other material has been withheld under exemptions related to ongoing deliberations, third-party proprietary information, and national security. The national security exemption, in the context of a heritage assessment, is unexpected. Its presence in the responses to archaeology-focused information requests is not easily explained by any of the standard rationales for restricting access to sensitive government information. What aspect of Sable Island's archaeological heritage is considered sensitive from a national security perspective is not specified in the partial releases. The exemption is cited but not explained, and in the bureaucratic framework that governs access to information in Canada, an unexplained citation of national security as a basis for withholding information is not easily challenged, because the information being withheld cannot be used to argue against its own withholding. This is the most structurally closed point in the investigation of Sable Island's restricted status. There is something in the archaeological record of Sable Island, or in the governmental knowledge of Sable Island's archaeological record, that is being treated as sensitive for national security purposes. What that something is cannot be determined from outside the system. The information about what the information is has been withheld. The gray seals of Sable Island are, like the horses, a genuine ecological treasure and a genuine public relations asset for the federal government's management of the island. The island supports one of the largest gray seal breeding colonies in the world, with a population that has grown dramatically since protection measures were implemented in the 1970s. The seals and the horses together give Sable Island a charismatic ecological identity that serves the public-facing narrative of the island as a pristine, natural sanctuary, a place so special that of course it must be protected from casual visitation. The seal population was not always as large as it is now. Historical accounts from the early period of European contact describe walrus as the dominant large marine mammal on Sable Island's beaches, with gray seals present but not dominant. The walrus were hunted to extinction on the island by the early decades of European exploitation. The convicts left there in 1598 are among the first Europeans documented as hunting Sable Island walrus, and within 2 centuries, the walrus were gone. The gray seals expanded to fill the ecological space left by the walrus, a process that took time and that the station records document with some care. What the station records also document, without drawing much attention to it, is that the shifting of the island's sand over the centuries has repeatedly revealed the skeletal remains of walrus at various locations across the interior. These remains are not surprising. Walrus bones buried in beach sand for 2 or 3 centuries is expected. What is occasionally surprising in accounts from station workers is the context in which some of those bones are found. Not simply scattered across the surface, as they would be if left where animals died, but in configurations that suggest they were arranged, or gathered, or placed in specific ways that are not consistent with random deposition. This observation, that some of the walrus bone material found on Sable Island appears to have been intentionally arranged, appears in accounts from different periods, from different station workers, without those workers being apparently aware that others had made the same observation before them. The accounts are independent of each other and arrive at similar descriptions. Walrus bones in the interior of the island in arrangements that suggest human activity. If those arrangements represent indigenous use of the island, Mi'kmaq hunters visiting the island's walrus population before European contact, processing kills in ways that left organized bone deposits that would be significant archaeological information about the extent and nature of indigenous engagement with Sable Island, and it would require the kind of investigation that the current management framework does not permit. If the arrangements are something else, if they predate the Mi'kmaq or represent a cultural tradition that is not currently accounted for in the known history of the region, that would be even more significant. The bones are in the sand. The sand keeps moving. What is visible one season may be invisible the next, and what the island reveals is not under anyone's deliberate control. But what gets reported and what gets done with those reports is under institutional control, and the institution that controls that process has demonstrated across a pattern that stretches back more than a century a consistent preference for receiving unusual information and generating nothing visible in response. The question of what Sable Island is ultimately a question about who gets to know things and who gets to decide what things are worth knowing. It is a question that has political and scientific and historical dimensions that are inseparable from each other, and it does not have a clean answer because the information required to construct a clean answer has not been made available. What can be said is this: Sable Island is one of the most geographically significant pieces of land in North America, in the literal sense that its position on the Atlantic approach to the continent has made it a witness to an extraordinary range of human activity across a time span that may be significantly longer than the official history acknowledges. The island has been a hazard and a refuge and a prison and a station and a nature reserve and a strategic asset, and quite possibly something older and stranger than any of those things. The ground beneath it contains a record of those uses, layered in sand that is always sorting itself, always bringing things to the surface, always bearing what was recently exposed. The institutions that manage the island have, across 2 centuries of continuous operation, developed a set of practices and protocols that function to control the rate at which that record becomes public knowledge. These practices were not necessarily designed as a system of concealment. They emerged from the accumulated responses of bureaucratic institutions to an environment that generates unusual information on a regular basis. The response of those institutions to unusual information has consistently been absorption. Take it in, send it up the chain, wait for direction, receive no direction, let the matter stand, said, rather than investigation and disclosure. The result is that what we know about Sable Island is the product of what the institutions managing it have chosen to let us know, filtered through a set of access restrictions and information management practices that serve multiple purposes and are not easily disentangled from each other. The ecological protection serves real ecological goals and also limits access. The meteorological research serves real scientific goals and also provides cover for other activities. The National Park Reserve designation serves real conservation goals and also creates a legal framework that limits the types of investigation that can be conducted. None of this is proof of a deliberate conspiracy to conceal specific information. What it is a structure that would serve such a purpose extremely well if such a purpose existed. A structure so well suited to managing information about an unusual place that its existence raises questions about whether it was assembled with that purpose in mind, even if those questions cannot be answered from the outside. People who have spent serious time thinking about Sable Island, historians, geographers, archaeologists, former station workers, tend to arrive at a particular position when pushed to say what they think the island might be hiding, if they are willing to speculate at all. That position is not dramatic. It is not conspiratorial in the paranoid sense. It is more like a trained professional reluctance, a sense that the questions around the island are real and the answers are not available, and the absence of available answers is itself a kind of answer. The most compelling version of that position goes something like this: Sable Island may contain evidence of human presence that predates the accepted timeline for the peopling of North America. Not dramatically, not by tens of thousands of years necessarily, but significantly enough that its public acknowledgement would require a revision of a narrative that has enormous institutional inertia behind it. the history of the Americas, as it is taught and as it has been politically encoded in the legal frameworks around Indigenous land rights and historical recognition, rests on a specific understanding of when people arrived in the Western Hemisphere and where they came from. If Sable Island's sand contains material evidence of a much earlier occupation of the Atlantic coastal plain, human artifacts from the period before sea level rise covered that landscape, from cultures that do not fit neatly into the existing framework of North American prehistory. The implications would extend far beyond archaeology. They would touch the legal foundations of Canadian land claims. They would complicate the political and moral accounting of colonization. They would require a renegotiation of who gets to tell the story of who was here first. This is the kind of finding that governments have historically been slow to embrace, and the kind of finding that the institutional culture around Sable Island has been, whether by design or by accretion, very well structured to prevent from becoming public knowledge prematurely. Prematurely meaning before the institutions that would need to respond to it have had time to understand its implications and develop a framework for managing them. Whether this is what is actually being managed around Sable Island cannot be determined from publicly available information. It is a hypothesis that is consistent with the available evidence. It is also a hypothesis that the institutions involved would have no incentive to confirm, and every incentive to neither confirm nor deny. What would it take to know the truth about Sable Island? In practical terms, not very much. A properly funded, properly permitted, multidisciplinary research program combining maritime archaeology, terrestrial archaeology, geological survey, archival research, and the kind of deep engagement with Mi'kmaq oral tradition that has not yet been seriously attempted, could, over a period of years, produce a significantly clearer picture of what the island is and what it contains. The technology exists. The scholarly expertise exists. The financial resources required, while not trivial, are not beyond the capacity of the Canadian government or a coalition of academic institutions to provide. What does not exist is the political will to commission such a program. This is, in itself, a kind of information. The federal government has demonstrated across decades of managing Sable Island that it prefers to control the rate at which knowledge about the island enters the public domain. A comprehensive research program of the type that would be required to answer the island's outstanding questions would, by its nature, remove that control. Whatever came out of such a program would become part of the scientific record and would have to be engaged with on its own terms, regardless of its implications. The management framework around Sable Island, the parks designation, the research permit system, the information management protocols, is a machine for making the rate of revelation manageable, not for stopping revelation entirely, which would be impossible on an island that is constantly moving and revealing things on its own, but for ensuring that what the island gives up is received and processed by institutions that can decide what to do with it before it becomes public. That machine is working. It has been working for a long time. And as long as it is working, the full truth of what Sable Island is will remain approximately as available as it is today. Visible in fragments, suggested by patterns, supported by the kind of evidence that is suggestive without being conclusive, and defended by a silence that is too consistent and too institutional to be entirely innocent. The island sits in the Atlantic, 300 kilometers from shore, and it keeps its secrets in the oldest way that anything keeps secrets, by moving, by being never quite the same place twice, by burying what it revealed last season and revealing what it buried the season before, by being a place that the ocean made, that the ocean is always trying to reclaim, and that in the meantime is neither fully land nor fully sea, but something in between, subject to rules that are not quite the same as the rules that govern the solid and the stable. The horses walk across it every day. The seals haul out on its shores. The grass holds the sand together against the wind. The fog comes and goes. The weather station records atmospheric data that will eventually be used to understand what the climate was like in a particular part of the Atlantic in a particular era. And underneath all of that, the sand keeps sorting. What it will bring to the surface next, and who will be there to receive it, and what will happen to the information once it is received, these questions remain open. They will remain open for as long as the institutional machine around Sable Island continues to function as it has always functioned, which is to say, for as long as the government of Canada decides it should. In the summer of 2016, a small group of researchers applied for access to Sable Island to conduct a study of coastal geomorphology, the physical process by which the island's shape changes over time. The study was legitimate, well-designed, and supported by a Canadian university with a strong record of Arctic and Atlantic coastal research. The research team applied for access through Parks Canada's standard permit process, submitted the required documentation, and waited. The permit was initially denied on grounds related to the research methodology. Specifically, the team's plan to use a particular type of ground-penetrating radar to characterize subsurface sediment layers was identified as potentially incompatible with the island's management plan. The team revised their methodology, removing the subsurface radar component and focusing exclusively on surface measurements and aerial photography. The revised application was resubmitted. The revised application remained under review for 14 months. During that time, the research team was unable to obtain specific information about the status of their application or the timeline for a decision. Standard inquiries to Parks Canada produced acknowledgements of receipt and statements that the application was under review. At no point was the team told that the application was rejected. At no point were they told what additional information, if any, would be required to advance the review. After 14 months, one member of the research team filed an access to information request seeking documents related to the review of their permit application. The documents produced in response to that request included internal communications that described the application as raising issues that required consultation with other federal departments. The specific departments cited in those communications were not identified by name. Their identities had been severed from the released documents under the exemption provisions of the Access to Information Act. The content of the consultations was withheld in its entirety. The permit was eventually issued in a modified form 2 years after the original application. The modification excluded any access to the interior of the island's eastern section, with no stated reason for the exclusion. The team conducted their research in the permitted areas and produced a study that was published in a peer-reviewed geomorphology journal. The study describes the island's coastal dynamics in considerable technical detail. It does not address the eastern section. The researchers involved in this episode are professional scientists with institutional affiliations and reputations to protect. They have not made public statements about their interpretation of what happened during the permit review. The record of what happened is in the Access to Information releases and in the published paper. What it shows is that a standard scientific access request to a national park was subjected to a multi-departmental security review that took 2 years and resulted in a specific geographic exclusion that was not explained. In a national park, this is the system working as it has always worked, quietly, slowly, producing outcomes that are defensible in administrative terms and opaque in substantive ones, ensuring that what is known about Sable Island remains what the system has chosen to allow to be known. The researchers got their permit. They did their research. They published their paper. and the eastern section of the island remained unexamined, as it has remained unexamined through every episode in the island's recorded history that would otherwise have produced information about it. Canada presents itself to the world as a country defined by openness, open governance, open borders, open landscapes. Its national parks system is built on the premise that the natural heritage of the country belongs to all Canadians, and that access to that heritage is a right, not a privilege. Sable Island National Park Reserve exists within that system, and it makes the argument in its public communications that it embodies those values. A protected wilderness, preserved for the future, managed with transparency and scientific integrity. The reality of Sable Island does not entirely contradict that argument. The ecological work done there is real and valuable. The weather records are real and valuable. The protection of the horses and the seals and the nesting birds is real and consequential. These are not fictions. They are genuine public goods that the federal government has invested real resources in producing. But they exist alongside something else, a 2-century accumulation of institutional practice around information management, a set of layered access restrictions that serve purposes beyond the ecological and scientific ones they are presented as serving, a pattern of bureaucratic response to unusual information that has been consistent across different governments, different departments, and different eras in a way that suggests something more durable than any individual administration's preferences. A specific exclusion maintained across every management regime that has operated on the island of the kind of deep archaeological investigation that would be required to know what the island actually contains beneath its surface. The island does not ask to be understood. It moves, and it reveals, and it buries, and it shifts, and it will still be doing those things long after every government that has ever claimed jurisdiction over it has been replaced by something else. The sand has no interest in the institutional structures built on top of it. It will sort itself according to the physics of wind and water, regardless of what the management plan says. What gets done with what the sand reveals is a human question. It is a political question. It is a question about who has the right to know the history of a place, and who gets to decide when that history becomes public, and what the calculation is that determines whether the benefits of disclosure outweigh whatever it is that the people who control the information believe they would lose by disclosing it. Sable Island is not the only place in Canada where that question is being navigated. It is not even the most dramatic example of restricted access to potentially significant historical sites. Canada's north contains far more dramatic examples of places whose history is controlled by overlapping layers of governmental authority, and whose secrets, if they have secrets, are far more effectively protected by sheer inaccessibility than Sable Island secrets are by the administrative machine that manages them. But Sable Island is unusual in that it is an old enough restriction and documented well enough across its history that the pattern is visible. The machine can be seen working. The inputs and outputs can be tracked across 2 centuries of operation. And what the tracking shows is a system that has been, from the very beginning of organized European engagement with the island, oriented toward the control of what is known. Whether what is being controlled is significant or trivial, genuinely consequential, or merely bureaucratically convenient is the question. And it is a question that can only be answered by doing exactly what the management framework of Sable Island does not permit, going there, looking under the surface, and reporting what is found to people other than the appropriate channels. Until that happens, and there is no reason to believe it will happen soon, Sable Island will remain what it has always been, a thin line of sand in the Atlantic, a graveyard and a sanctuary, and a research station and a mystery, a place where the fog comes in so thick that you cannot see your own hand in front of your face, where the horses materialize out of gray, nothing, and are gone again before you can be sure they were real, where the ocean presses in on both sides, and the ground shifts under your feet, and the wind carries the sound of 300 years of shipwrecks in frequencies just below the threshold of hearing. A place the government says you cannot visit, a place whose secrets, if they are secrets, are held in sand that keeps moving, whether anyone is watching or not. A place that has been at the center of Canadian history since before Canada existed, and that has been very carefully kept at the edge of what Canadians are allowed to know about themselves. The island is still there. The fog is still coming. And somewhere in the sand, in the shifting layers of centuries, the record of what Sable Island actually is either waiting to be found or waiting to be buried one more time. The question is, which one the next tide will bring. There is something that needs to be said about the specific experience of trying to research Sable Island from the outside, not from the island itself, which most people will never be permitted to visit, but from the archives and databases and access to information, requests, and academic journals and gray literature reports that constitute the publicly accessible record of what the island is and what has happened there. That experience is unlike the experience of researching most places. It has a particular quality that is difficult to describe without sounding conspiratorial, because the quality is not the dramatic discovery of suppressed documents or the encounter with officials who make threatening statements. It is quieter than that, more institutional, more like trying to read a book where occasional pages have been carefully removed and the binding has been sealed back together so neatly that if you were not counting pages, you might not notice the gaps. The gaps are what tell you something is there. If there were nothing unusual about Sable Island's history, the record would be continuous and boring. You would find what you always find when you research a remote government-operated station: detailed operational records, administrative correspondence, scientific reports, the slow bureaucratic accumulation of documentation that governments produce simply by functioning. You would find a complete, if dull, account of a weather station on a sandbar. What you find instead is something that is almost that, but not quite, almost continuous, but with specific gaps at specific junctures, almost detailed, but with particular subjects treated in language so vague that it communicates without informing, almost boring, but with enough anomalies scattered through it that the document as a whole takes on a different character when you stand back and look at its shape rather than its content. The shape is the story. The content is what they decided to tell you. The shape is what they could not prevent you from seeing. The shape of the Sable Island record suggests that there are at least 3 distinct episodes in the island's documented history where something happened that the institutional response to was different from the institutional response to normal events. These episodes are not identifiable by their content because the content is precisely what has not been preserved or disclosed. They are identifiable by their effects on the record around them, by the sudden termination of correspondence threads that had been active, by the appearance of new protocols and procedures with no stated rationale, by the existence of files that are indexed and referenced in finding aids, but whose contents cannot be accessed under any available information request framework. The 3 junctures in question correspond, roughly, to the mid-19th century, specifically the period around 1860 to 1870, and to the early 1940s and to the late 1970s. In each case, the record around Sable Island changes character in a way that suggests a significant event or discovery that was processed outside the normal documentation channel. In each case, the event or discovery itself cannot be reconstructed from publicly available information. And in each case, the change in the record is followed by a change in the access protocols around the island. A tightening, a formalization, a new set of restrictions that outlasted whatever immediate circumstances might have motivated them. The 1860s juncture is the most obscure. It corresponds with a period of significant geological activity on the island. The station records from that era describe a sequence of particularly severe winter storms that dramatically reshaped the island's surface over a period of 2 or 3 years, exposing large areas of previously buried material. The station superintendent's reports from this period become notably less detailed in their descriptions of operational conditions around the same time that the storm damage reports become more prominent. The connection between those two things, the exposure of previously buried material and the reduction in operational detail in the superintendent's reports, may be coincidental. It may not be. The early 1940s juncture overlaps with wartime, which provides an obvious explanation for any unusual changes in access protocols and information management. The Second World War created extraordinary information control requirements across all of Canada's sensitive locations, and Sable Island was certainly a sensitive location given its strategic position. The documentation from this period is more thoroughly withheld than documentation from any other period in the island's history. Large sections of what would normally be routine operational records from the early 1940s are either missing from the archive or present in forms so heavily redacted as to be operationally meaningless. The wartime explanation covers this to a point, but the specific pattern of redaction, which subjects are present in redacted form and which are simply absent, suggests that some of what was removed from the record was not primarily about military operations or communication security. It is about the island itself, about what was found there and what was done about it. The late 1970s juncture is the most precisely datable and the most intriguing from a scientific perspective. It corresponds with a period when the development of satellite remote sensing technology first made it possible to systematically characterize the seafloor around Sable Island from a distance. Before satellite remote sensing, detailed knowledge of the seafloor around the island required direct survey work, ships, divers, equipment deployed at sea. Those operations were difficult, expensive, and rare. After satellite remote sensing became operational, the knowledge base about the waters around Sable Island expanded rapidly, at least within the governmental and institutional bodies that had access to the satellite data. That data, in its unprocessed form, is proprietary to the agencies that commissioned its collection. What the satellites saw around Sable Island in the late 1970s is not public knowledge. What the agencies that received that data decided to do as a consequence of it, including changes to the island's access protocols in 1978 and 1979 that have never been publicly explained, is visible in its effects and obscure in its causes. These three junctures do not constitute a narrative. They are marks on a timeline, each pointing to something that happened and was absorbed, and together forming a pattern that is too regular to be entirely random and too obscure to be entirely decoded from outside the system that produced it. The electromagnetic character of Sable Island is something that serious scientists discuss carefully, and that popular accounts of the island sometimes exaggerate into something it is not. The island does have unusual electromagnetic properties. These are measurable, documented, and scientifically explicable as a consequence of its geographic position, its physical composition, and its relationship to the atmospheric dynamics of the North Atlantic. The meeting of the Labrador Current and the Gulf Stream in the waters around Sable Island creates electrical conditions in the overlying atmosphere that are genuinely unusual. The temperature and salinity gradients at the oceanic fronts in that area generate electrical charges in the marine boundary layer, the layer of atmosphere closest to the ocean surface, that affect the behavior of electromagnetic signals in ways that are relevant to both navigation and communications. This is one of the reasons the island has been used for atmospheric research. The electrical conditions there are interesting. They are also, for certain types of communications and surveillance technology, problematic in specific and interesting ways. During the Cold War, the electrical environment around Sable Island created both opportunities and challenges for the acoustic and electromagnetic surveillance infrastructure that both sides of the conflict were developing in the North Atlantic. The specific effect of the Sable Island electromagnetic environment on SOSUS and related systems has not been made public, but the island's position means that any underwater acoustic monitoring network in the North Atlantic would have to account for it. What is publicly known is that the atmospheric research conducted on Sable Island has, from its earliest days, included work on electromagnetic propagation in the marine boundary layer, the way radio waves and other electromagnetic signals travel through the thick, electrically active air above the ocean surface near the island. This research has legitimate scientific applications in meteorology and oceanography. It also has applications in military communications, in electronic warfare, and in the detection of objects, submarines, surface vessels, aircraft, that use electromagnetic signatures for their operation. The connection between the island's electromagnetic research and its defense applications has not been publicly drawn by any official source. The research publications that emerge from the island's atmospheric work do not address defense applications directly, but the funding of that research and the affiliations of the institutions conducting it include entities whose primary mandate is not civilian meteorological science. The specific electromagnetic anomalies that the island's position creates are also relevant to another dimension of the island's unusual character, the navigation difficulty that has caused the extraordinary shipwreck toll over the centuries. Much of that toll is explicable by the combination of fog, shallow water, and dangerous currents. But there is a dimension of the navigation problem around Sable Island that experienced mariners historically reported as going beyond the standard hazards, a magnetic irregularity, a compass anomaly, a feeling that the instruments were not quite behaving as expected. Historical records from ships that survived their approach to the island occasionally mention compass behavior that the navigators found surprising. Modern GPS navigation has made this largely an academic concern, but the historical record of navigational anomalies around Sable Island is part of the texture of the place's reputation, and it connects to the electromagnetic research that has been conducted there in ways that are not quite accidents. The Scots-Canadian author Thomas Rattle wrote about Sable Island in the middle of the 20th century with the attention of someone who had absorbed the island deeply and processed it into language that repays reading decades later. Rattle was not a conspiracy theorist or a sensationalist. He was a careful, historically minded writer who worked from primary sources and personal observation, and his accounts of Sable Island are grounded in a specific, practical engagement with the place and its documented history. What makes his writing interesting for present purposes is not anything dramatic, he reveals, but rather the quality of his descriptions of the island's atmosphere, the specific way in which the place acts on people who spend time there. Rattle describes what he calls the island's personality, not in a mystical sense, but in the sense that any place has a personality, a set of consistent characteristics that define the experience of being there and that exert pressure on the people who inhabit it over time. Sable Island's personality, as Rattle understood it, was defined by impermanence. Everything on the island was provisional. The sand gave, and the sand took away. The fog arrived, and the fog lifted. The horses appeared and vanished. The wrecks were built, and destroyed, and built again, and destroyed again. Nothing stayed. The island's history was a continuous process of formation and dissolution, of things coming up from the sand and going back down into it, of the human record, accumulating and eroding at the same rate so that the net gain was always approximately zero. This is, in retrospect, a precise description of a place whose institutional management has produced the same effect at the information level. The human record around Sable Island has accumulated and eroded at approximately the same rate, not by natural process, but by institutional management, so that the net gain of publicly available knowledge about the island is always approximately zero. New research appears, other research disappears into the access protocols. New accounts surface from people who have spent time there, and they are absorbed by the silence of institutions that are very good at receiving unusual information without producing visible output. The island keeps its personality because the institutions that manage it have replicated its essential character at the documentary level: impermanence, provisionality, a continuous process of revelation and concealment that leaves the essential mystery intact. This is either a remarkable coincidence or a very deliberate piece of institutional design. It may be both. The people who built the management system around Sable Island were in many cases people who had spent time there and had absorbed its personality. Perhaps they replicated it unconsciously. Perhaps they replicated it deliberately because they understood that the best way to manage a place with uncomfortable secrets is to give the place's management the same character as the place itself. Provisional, shifting, always apparently revealing something and actually revealing less than it appears. The Weekmak, using the alternate spelling that some scholars prefer as closer to the original pronunciation, maintained relationships with islands and coastal features along the Atlantic margin that European cartographers were slow to acknowledge, and that colonial administrators were slow to take seriously as sources of geographic knowledge. The history of Mi'kmaq navigation in the North Atlantic is a subject that has received increasing scholarly attention in recent years, partly as a consequence of the broader movement toward acknowledging the sophistication of indigenous geographic knowledge, and partly as a consequence of specific historical discoveries that have made the extent of pre-contact Atlantic navigation harder to dismiss. The oral traditions of the Mi'kmaq people contain navigational knowledge about Sable Island and the waters around it that is consistent with direct observation over extended periods. The traditional knowledge about the island's shifting geography, its movement, its changing shape, its relationship to the surrounding ocean, is detailed enough to suggest regular engagement with the island across many generations. Whether that engagement involved landing on the island or simply navigating around it is a question the oral tradition does not resolve with the specificity that Western academic standards would require. But the question of Mi'kmaq use of Sable Island is not separable from the question of Indigenous rights to the island, and this is where the subject becomes politically charged in ways that have historically discouraged formal investigation. The legal framework governing Indigenous land rights in Canada is complex and contentious, and the status of offshore islands in that framework is particularly complicated. Sable Island's designation as a national park reserve, which is a federal designation, would in principle be subject to negotiation with Indigenous groups who can demonstrate historical connection to the land. Whether the Mi'kmaq nation's historical relationship with Sable Island constitutes such a connection, and whether the federal government's management of the island has appropriately engaged with Mi'kmaq rights holders, are questions that have not been publicly resolved. The Assembly of Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq Chiefs has been engaged in ongoing discussions with the federal government about various aspects of Mi'kmaq rights in Nova Scotia, including offshore resources and territories. The specific status of Sable Island in those discussions is not a matter of public record. What is known is that the National Park Reserve designation process, which was completed in 2013, included consultation with Mi'kmaq groups, and that the nature and outcome of those consultations was not fully disclosed in the public documentation of the designation process. When you ask Mi'kmaq knowledge keepers about Sable Island, you get answers that are different from the answers you get from Parks Canada or from the academic literature about the island. The answers are not more dramatic or more specific in the conspiratorial sense. They do not describe hidden chambers or buried treasure or classified military installations. They describe a place that is understood within the Mi'kmaq intellectual tradition as having a significance that goes beyond what the European-derived frameworks that now govern the island's management are equipped to recognize. A place that is connected to larger patterns of relationship between people and land and ocean in ways that the management plan doesn't account for. This is not a small thing. The management of a place in ways that are structurally unable to perceive what is most significant about it is a form of mismanagement, even when every individual decision made within that framework is technically defensible. The framework for understanding Sable Island that has been built by 2 centuries of colonial and then federal administration is a framework designed to serve specific purposes: meteorological research, ecological protection, resource management, and it is genuinely well suited to those purposes. It is not suited to the purpose of understanding what the place actually is, in the fullest sense, because that purpose requires a different kind of knowledge than the framework possesses. The different kind of knowledge exists. It is held by people whose relationship with the island and its surrounding waters is older and more multidimensional than the relationship that the federal management system represents. That knowledge has not been seriously sought by the management system, and the management system's current design does not create strong incentives to seek it. This is, in the end, perhaps the most straightforward explanation for why Sable Island remains mysterious, not because of what is being hidden, but because of what has never been asked. The last supply ship of the season always left Sable Island in late autumn, before the North Atlantic storms made the crossing too dangerous to be reliable. For the station workers who stayed through the winter, and in the early decades of the establishment's operation, someone always stayed through the winter, maintaining the lights and the weather records and the watch for wrecks. The departure of that last ship was the moment when the island became fully real in a way that it was not during the months when the mainland was accessible. Winter on Sable Island was its own category of experience. The storms that came in from the Atlantic were not like mainland storms. They were oceanic events, building across thousands of kilometers of open water and arriving at the island with a force that was difficult to prepare for even when you had experienced it before. The island offered no natural windbreaks, no shelter from topography, no elevation to climb above the worst of it. The station buildings took the full force of every storm, and the sand moved around them during every gale, bearing equipment and objects and the smaller structures that were not anchored against it, revealing them again, weeks or months later in conditions that made recovery possible. The station keepers who spent winters on Sable Island wrote about those winters with a consistency that suggests the experience produced reliable effects on the people who went through it. Not breakdown, not psychological damage in the clinical sense, but a recalibration of attention that was difficult to undo after the fact. A winter on Sable Island changed what you noticed. It changed your relationship with sound. The station workers all described becoming acutely sensitive to changes in the sound of the wind and the ocean. learning to read meteorological conditions from acoustic cues that they could not have consciously articulated. It changed your relationship with the surface of the island, learning to read what the sand told you about what had happened there recently, which patches had shifted in the night, which areas felt different underfoot in ways that experienced station workers could not always explain, but that consistently turned out to predict specific changes in the island's surface. This embodied knowledge of the island, the kind of knowledge that comes from living on a place rather than visiting it, from learning its personality by surviving its winters, was precisely the kind of knowledge that was most difficult to transmit through the official documentation channels. Station keepers wrote their reports in the standard administrative format, describing events and conditions in the language required by the format, and a great deal of what they knew about the island never made it into those reports, because the reports did not have categories for it. The island was teaching its inhabitants things that the forms did not ask about. What those things were, what the accumulated, embodied knowledge of 2 centuries of station workers adds up to, is not recoverable from the documentary record. It lives in the oral tradition of the small community of people and their descendants who have direct connection to the station's history, and that community is small enough and old enough that what is not recorded now may not be recoverable much longer. There are researchers who understand this and who have been attempting to collect those accounts before they are lost. The work is quiet and slow and produces results that are difficult to publish in conventional academic formats. It is being done because a small number of people understand that what the station workers knew, in the embodied and observational sense, is a kind of archive that does not have a building or a finding aid or a federal departmental home. It is an archive that is stored in human memory and human lineage, and that is subject to the same kind of gradual erosion that affects all such archives. The island does not wait for that research to be completed. It keeps sorting its sand. It keeps revealing what it has been keeping and burying what it has recently shown. It operates on its own schedule, which is the schedule of wind and tide, and the slow physics of a massive sand body being pushed through the North Atlantic by currents that have been moving in the same direction for thousands of years. Whatever is under Sable Island will come up eventually. The only question is whether anyone with the authority and the inclination to pay attention to what comes up will be there when it does, and whether the institutional framework that currently manages what happens to unusual finds will, by that point, have developed the capacity to respond to them in a way that serves knowledge rather than managing it. That is not a question anyone in the federal government is currently asking publicly. It is a question that the island's history suggests has been answered implicitly by the consistent behavior of every administration that has managed the island since the first life-saving station was built there in 1801. The answer has always been the same. The management will manage. The channels will channel. The appropriate parties will be notified. And the sand will keep moving, indifferent to all of it, carrying the record of what the island actually is, through the same fog that has been hiding it from the mainland for as long as anyone has been keeping records. There is an island in Canada where nobody's allowed to go. And the longer you look at the reasons why, the less any single reason seems to be the real one, and the more the question becomes not what is on the island, but what the island represents, a test of how much a government can control not just access to a place, but access to the knowledge that the place contains. Whether that test has been passed or failed depends on what you think knowledge is for and who you think it belongs to. The fog is rolling in again. The horses are somewhere out there in it, moving across ground that is not the same ground it was last year, following paths that their ancestors established before anyone now alive was born. The sand is sorting. The ocean is pressing in. And somewhere in the layers beneath the grass and the horse tracks and the seal paths, and the remains of the life-saving station, and everything else that the island has accumulated and is slowly bearing, the record of what this place has always been, is waiting in the dark, patient as geology, for someone with the right tools and the right permissions and the right moment to find it. Whether that moment comes is not up to the island. It never has been. Every country has its version of Sable Island, a place held in official suspension, documented precisely enough to forestall the accusation of concealment, but not completely enough to answer the questions that the documentation itself raises. A place whose official story is technically accurate and functionally incomplete. A place that serves as a kind of national test case for the proposition that open societies can maintain genuinely closed spaces indefinitely without the fact of that closure eventually becoming its own kind of revelation. Canada is not unusual in having such a place. What is unusual about Sable Island is the duration. Most restricted zones in democratic countries eventually open. The documents get declassified. The research programs get defunded, and the facilities are decommissioned, and someone writes an access to information request that produces something genuinely useful, and the story gets told, incompletely but legibly, in a way that closes the loop on at least some of the outstanding questions. The cycle from restriction to partial disclosure is a normal feature of how governments manage sensitive information over time. Sable Island has been restricted in one form or another since the first organized European settlement on the island in 1801. The form of the restriction has changed over 2 centuries, and the justification for it has shifted with each change in the political and scientific and military context. But the essential fact that access to the island is controlled, that what happens on the island is managed through channels that are not publicly transparent, and that the full accounting of what the island is and what it contains has not been provided, has been continuous. This continuity is the most remarkable thing about it. Governments come and go. Political priorities change. Scientific paradigms shift. Information technology transforms what can be known from the outside. And yet the essential posture of the Canadian government towards Sable Island has remained the same across all of those changes, not because any individual government has made a deliberate decision to maintain it, necessarily, but because the institutional structures that were built to manage the island have their own inertia. They continue to function along the lines they were established to function along, absorbing new contexts and new technologies and new political pressures while maintaining the core pattern. Control access, manage information, process unusual finds through channels that do not produce public output. Understanding that pattern is not the same as understanding what motivates it. The pattern could be motivated by something genuinely significant: archaeological material, military infrastructure, geological information about the island's prehistory, or it could be motivated by nothing more than the institutional habit of an administrative culture that has always managed this island this way and has never been given a sufficiently compelling reason to change. Bureaucratic inertia is real. It explains a great deal of governmental behavior that might otherwise seem calculated. The possibility that Sable Island's restricted status is maintained largely because changing it would require more effort than maintaining it should not be dismissed, but bureaucratic inertia also has limits. Institutions that are protecting nothing do not typically invoke national security exemptions in response to archaeology permit applications. They do not conduct multi-departmental consultations before allowing a research team to study coastal geomorphology. They do not maintain, across 2 centuries and a dozen different political administrations, the same essential pattern of access control and information management around a piece of land that is, officially, just a sandbar with some horses on it. The level of institutional attention devoted to managing Sable Island is not proportionate to its official status as an ecological preserve and weather station. It is proportionate to something else. What that something else is remains for now, a question that the institution managing it is not required to answer, and has chosen not to answer, and may never choose to answer, because the framework within which the question is being asked does not require an answer. This is how it works, not with dramatic cover-ups or obvious deception, but with the perfectly calibrated management of access and information that makes the withholding of knowledge look from the outside exactly like the normal functioning of a federal agency responsible for a remote and ecologically sensitive location. So normal that most people, most of the time, do not ask the questions that would reveal it as something else. The island sits in the fog, the government sits in Ottawa, and between them, 300 kilometers of North Atlantic water that is cold enough to kill you in minutes and old enough to have been moving in approximately this direction since before the first human being ever set eyes on what would eventually become the coast of Canada. The island has been keeping whatever it is keeping for a very long time. It will keep it a while longer. The sand will sort. The fog will hold. The horses will walk paths that were old before the life-saving station was built, on ground that is not quite the same ground it was yesterday, above layers of history that neither the institution that manages the island nor the people that institution serves have been permitted to fully read. Until the day someone is. Until the day the permission is granted and the tools are brought and the sand is carefully examined by people who know what they are looking at and are authorized to say what they see. Until that day, which may come or may not come, the only honest answer to the question of what Sable Island is hiding is this: we do not know because we have not been allowed to look. And the fact that we have not been allowed to look across 2 centuries and dozens of administrations and every technological advance that has made remote investigation easier and more precise, that fact is itself the most significant thing we know about it. The island is forbidden. The reasons are officially stated and institutionally maintained and historically consistent and operationally inexplicable. And somewhere in that gap between the stated and the inexplicable, in that space that the fog has occupied for centuries and the institution has occupied since the fog was cleared enough to build a station in, the truth of Sable Island is sitting in the sand, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question to the right person, with enough authority behind it to compel an actual answer. That person has not yet arrived. But the island is patient. The island has always been patient. It has been watching ships wreck on its shores for 500 years, and it has been sorting their cargo into its sand and giving it back up when it is ready, and it has never once been in a hurry about any of it. It operates on geological time. The institutions that think they are managing it operate on political time. And political time, in the long run, is nothing. It is a brief disturbance in a process that was already old when the first European ship set a course for the coast of Nova Scotia and discovered, at the cost of its hull and possibly its crew, that there was something in the water that the charts did not yet show. The island is still there. Go and find out for yourself. Oh, but you cannot. That is rather the point. And that point, that you cannot, is not a neutral administrative fact. It is a choice made, renewed, and maintained across every government that has held power in Canada since Confederation. A choice that has survived the freedom of information era, survived the digital revolution that made geographic information freely available from space, survived the scholarly movement toward open data and transparent governance, and the public ownership of cultural heritage. The choice to keep this island closed has outlasted every cultural and political force that should, in theory, have opened it. The Mi'kmaq people, who know this coastline better than anyone who ever worked for Parks Canada, have their own understanding of why a place like Sable Island demands a particular kind of respect. It is not the respect of legal designation or bureaucratic protection. It is the respect of recognition, recognizing that a place has its own nature, its own relationship to time, its own relationship to what is known and what is kept. In that tradition, some places hold things not because they are being guarded, but because they are not finished with what they are doing. The island is not finished. The sand is still sorting. The story is still being written in layers that no one who has ever been authorized to read them has fully read. What happens when the sorting is done? When the island has given up everything it intends to give up, and the record is complete and the account can finally be taken, is a question for a future that is genuinely unimaginable from here. The island will not last forever. The physics of its existence are not in its favor. Eventually, the ocean will win. The sand will disperse. What is in the layers will scatter across the seafloor and be lost to the kind of recovery that is possible today, but might not be possible then. The window is open now. The island is here. The record is in the sand. And the question of whether this generation will be the one that finally looks, or whether it will be another generation that passes the unanswered question forward, is the only question about Sable Island that anyone actually has the power to resolve. The fog is patient. The island is patient. The question is whether we are.